Well, hello again everybody, here we are again, and here's the third of my 3rd century emperors. This is the occasionally terrifying Diocletian. We'll come on to why he was terrifying in a bit, but first of all a bit of background about him. He is not from Rome, he's actually from what is now Croatia, from the modern city of Split, which is where he actually retired. I'll come back to retirement in a bit. So he started out from Croatia, then the Roman province of Dalmatia, and like pretty much everybody else, he joined the army and started making his way up through the ranks. His early life is pretty obscure and quite a lot argued about, but it's clearly military. To cut a long story short, to cut to the interesting bit about him, he was hailed as emperor in 284 AD. So this is pretty much at the end of the 50 years of the 3rd century crisis, when there'd been 26 emperors in 50 years, including Philip the Arab, whom I spoke about yesterday. The economy was in a catastrophic situation, not least because nobody much trusted the coinage. Philip the Arab had started debasing the coinage. People had resorted to barter a great deal, so there were great problems with the coinage and with the economy and with trade, both within the empire and with people outside the empire too. There were problems with the army, because the army weren't getting paid properly, and so some of them had started to be pretty disaffected, and that led to weakness on the frontiers, which again was made worse by the fact that the frontiers had been weakened for the previous 50 years because the Roman economy simply couldn't afford it. So he came in, he reformed taxation, and this was a pretty important thing. And rather than taxation being in goods, he set much fairer assessment of taxation, had a big census and decided who was going to pay what, which started to reset the economy onto something like an even keel. He reformed the currency too, and abandoned the old denarii and sesterces and so on, and came up with a new system which was a gold coin called an aureus, solidus, and he kept the denarii as well. He reformed administration. There were an awful lot of bureaucrats under Diocletian, but although he was absolutely autocratic and retained the right to appoint anybody anywhere, there was a certain amount of devolution of power from Rome. And so there came to be regional centres in places such as Milan, Mediolanum, and Izmir, and also in Augusta Treverorum in Trier in Germany. So that was pretty important. This took power away from the Senate, and so there were a number of conservative forces in Rome who didn't really like him very much. Fairly early on in his emperorship, he launched a huge and terrible persecution of the Christian church. He was egged on in this by his co-emperor, but it was perhaps the most brutal of all the persecutions of Christians that there ever was. And there's copious records of how savage indeed this was, with descriptions of the unspeakable tortures and the humiliations which were brought upon the church. During the Great Persecution, one of the most famous martyrdoms, of which there were very many, was the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian. And he was supposed to have been tied to a post or a pillar and then shot through with arrows. And this failed to kill him, and there were various other things that were done to him to try and kill him. But it took a very long time, and Sebastian was therefore regarded as a martyr who would be helpful in times of plague, and his assistance was much prayed for during the Middle Ages when there were many plagues, and he was one of the most venerated saints of the early church. And he became quite popular as an image to be painted by painters such as Mantegna and Caravaggio. Now this had a somewhat unexpected effect, in that the Alexandrian church started numbering years after the beginning of the Great Persecution, as years AD. Now this did not mean originally Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. It originally meant Anno Diocletiano, so in the year of Diocletian. So it was counting the number of years since the Great Persecution began. Now, somewhat later, into the 4th century, it was decided by the church that they didn't like that anymore, and so rather than commemorating Diocletian, they would keep the numbering system of AD, but instead call it Anno Domini, or Domini, as we suppose we should pronounce it, in the year of our Lord. But by that time, nobody was entirely sure what year Jesus had born in, and indeed, we're still not certain entirely what year he was born in. So AD goes back to the time of the great persecution of Diocletian. The other great thing, or the most important thing that Diocletian did, was in order to stop the huge inflation, he introduced a compulsory edict on prices and wages. And some copies of this have survived in inscriptional form, mostly from the eastern part of the empire. So I'm going to share a couple of these with you now, because they're quite interesting, I think. So if you wanted to buy 1 Italian measure of beer, the cheapest sort was Egyptian beer. If, on the other hand, you wanted Gallic or Pannonian, that is Hungarian beer, that was twice as expensive. But it was still much cheaper even than the cheapest wine. And so we know how much different sorts of wine cost. So, for instance, what's described as ordinary wine was 8 denarii per unit, whereas if you went for something fancy like Falernian wine, that's kind of top of the range stuff, that was 30. So it was almost 4 times as much as the cheapest sort. If you wanted to buy meat, then if you wanted 1 Italian pound of pork, best quality pork, that would cost you 20 denarii. If, on the other hand, you wanted pork mincemeat, that was only 2 denarii, so I suppose that would be quite good for making sausages. We also know how much a fattened pheasant cost, that was 250 denarii, whereas a wild one was only half of that, so presumably smaller and not so meaty, so that was only 125. We know what wages were like. If you wanted to hire a farm labourer, that was 25 denarii a day. A carpenter, on the other hand, is 50 denarii a day. If you wanted a picture painter, 150 denarii a day. So quite interesting, the differentials there. But the ones that are most interesting to me are how much teachers got paid. So elementary teacher, so this is the very first level of teacher, per boy, per month, 50 denarii. If, on the other hand, you were a teacher of arithmetic, that was 75 denarii a month per boy. If you were a teacher of Greek or Latin, or a teacher of geometry, so maths and classics going hand in hand, 200 denarii a month. So clearly a much higher status. If, on the other hand, top of the range this, if you were a teacher of rhetoric, public speaking, per person, per student, per boy this would be, or young man, that was 250 denarii a month. So you could get quite a lot of Egyptian beer for that, or quite a lot of pork mincemeat to make your sausages. It's quite interesting, though, to reflect at these turbulent economic times that it was found necessary to impose an edict of prices and wages to kind of stabilise things. Sadly for Diocletian, it didn't last that long, and although it stabilised things, within 3 or 4 years he'd gone back to the standard economic way. Diocletian, at the end of his career as emperor, after 21 years as an emperor, which was pretty remarkable given there had been 26 emperors in the previous 50 years, he retired, and this was virtually unheard of at the time because pretty much everybody else was assassinated. So the fact that he lived that long and retired shows that he had some success in doing what he did. So there you have Diocletian. Good guy or bad guy? Terrible persecutor. Reformer? Stabilise things? Leave it up to you to make your mind up on that one.